Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I have just a couple of different subjects for you because I'm probably going to do a bit of a fairly deep dive into both of them. The first one is this piece by Jack Watling, another Jack Watling piece, who also writes for RUSI, Royal United Services Institute. This is a foreign affairs piece. The war in Ukraine is not a stalemate. Last year's counteroffensive failed, but the West can prevent a Russian victory this year. Okay, so let's go for it. I've just highlighted a few key points. So the perception of stalemate, however, is deeply flawed, he says. Both Moscow and Kiev are in a race to rebuild offensive combat power. In a conflict of this scale, that process will take time. While the first half of 2024 may bring few changes in control of Ukrainian territory, the materiel, personnel training and casualties at each side accrues in the next few months will determine the long-term trajectory of the conflict. The West in fact faces a crucial choice right now: support Ukraine so that its leaders can defend their territory and prepare for a 2025 offensive, or cede an irrecoverable advantage to Russia. So it's the idea that, look, 2024 may well be it's not so much a stalemate like you're both fighting vociferously at each other and just doing this and not getting anywhere. It's actually, you're not really fighting that much. You're working strategically with allies to procure materiel, to get ammunition, to train your troops, and all the while you are doing thrusts here and there to keep the other side fixing and attriting so that they don't get a chance to reconstitute, regenerate, and so on, and train, and so on and so forth. And we'll come back to that idea in a little while. So it continues a bit later. What the United States and Europe do over the next 6 months will determine one of two futures. In one, Ukraine can build up its forces to renew offensive operations and degrade Russian military strength to the degree that Kiev can enter negotiations with a leverage to impose a lasting peace. In the other, a shortage of supplies and trained personnel will mire Ukraine in an attritional struggle that will leave it exhausted and facing eventual subjugation. So, of course, enter stage left the issues in Congress in the US at the moment with regard to that huge amount of funding. And in light of that, the nations of Europe, some nations in Europe really trying to step up and spend a lot, but then other nations in Europe not doing that. And those first nations going, hang on, like Olaf Scholz recently, hang on, guys, you need to keep up here, because if we're not getting help from the US, then actually we've got to do the heavy lifting here. And whatever happens, Ukraine needs our help, and it's in the best interests of a united Europe, of the European Union, but also the continent of Europe in general, for geopolitical reasons, the economic stability and security, as well as, political stability as well. Ukraine's international partners must remember that the first outcome is desirable not only to Ukrainians. It is necessary to protect the international norm that states do not change their borders by force. I mean, I can't tell you how important this is. And when it goes back to, again, the issues I had this morning with the US holding back funding, or at least some politicians in the US. And by the way, I wasn't attacking the US. I never know whether they're just outright trolls, like Russian trolls, or Americans that are a bit hurt by what I've said. I'm not attacking America, goodness no. I'm attacking certain politicians in the US that have taken a stance that I vehemently disagree with. So it's this idea that, you know what, like, yeah, you may now think, as I said, I don't want to go over old ground, but I just restate this. You may now think that the southern border in the United States is the single most important thing in the universe. But actually, you can walk and chew gum. You can sort that out and work really hard to sort that out. It's a really prickly issue. And okay, that needs fixing in some way. But you can also chew gum and help Ukraine, and one isn't contingent on the other, as I keep saying. But if you don't help Ukraine and you're worrying about this, you're looking inwards or outwards to the south, I guess. If you're so transfixed by that problem, then you will allow all sorts of crazy stuff to go on in the world, which will not help the US. Will not help the US at all. And so allowing Ukraine to get hammered over 6 months a year by not giving funding, and then if elections change leadership in the US, then things might change then. Honestly, it will not bode well for the US in general as the international proponent of the rules-based order and being at the top of that hegemony, that's being the supreme power in that hegemonic landscape, and getting those trade deals and having an economy that benefits from that. As soon as you step back from that and say, actually, that isn't as important as the southern border, and try and sort that out alone rather than trying to do both, it will come back and bite the US on the arse. I'm absolutely positive. So a mobilized and emboldened Russia, says Watling, would pose a sustained threat to NATO, requiring the US to indefinitely underwrite deterrence in Europe. And here's the issue, and I guess this is why some of those MAGA Republicans are saying we need to get out of NATO. Because the thing is, if you don't support Ukraine, then you are going to have boots on the ground in some way, because Russia and even China, things are not looking cool, and Russia will be, as Watling says, emboldened. And then that's an even bigger problem going forward. So the most isolationist of the US politicians and base for the GOP maybe are saying, well, we need to pull out of NATO then. And then that is basically just rescinding all rights to being at that top of that hegemony. And as I say, that's isolationist. You might like that, but I'll tell you what, in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, it won't look too cool for the US. And you're just basically saying to BRICS, hey, BRICS, run with it. Here's the world, run with it. That in that real, if you're going really down that isolationist, come out of NATO, stop working in concert with the EU, concerned only with your own issues and not concerned about your neighbours in the world. Someone said to me this morning in the threads, why should the US sort out European problems or something? That typical talking point. I was like, let's turn that around and ask that question again. Why should a human be concerned with sorting out human problems? We're all in this world together. Yeah, there might be a distance. I might see my neighbour's house on fire over the road and think, that's a bit far away for me to be bothered to go and help. I can't be asked to take a bucket of water over there. I only take a bucket of water to my own fence if my neighbours set it on fire. Other than that, I'm not really bothered about my neighbours. Or you can say, my next door neighbours is on fire. I'm going to help them. Or my neighbour across the road is on fire. I'm going to help them as well, because, hey, we're all humans in this neighbourhood. We're all humans on this planet. And actually, watching one massive set of humans aggressively invade another set of humans and take over that land sets a precedent to the whole world when China is looking. And if China ain't your mate, which US, both sides of the aisle keep saying that China's your number one enemy, well, if they're going to be looking at Russia doing what they're doing in Ukraine, and the US giving them permission to do that by not giving the requisite aid, then China will say, thank you very much, Taiwan, thank you very much, Indo-Pacific, thank you very much, and the whole global structure changes. And as Watling indeed says, requiring the US to indefinitely underwrite deterrence in Europe if they don't help now, that would constrain the US's capacity to project force in the Indo-Pacific and substantially increase the danger of conflict over Taiwan. The West can choose which direction history takes, but first it must acknowledge the gravity of the decision it currently faces. And this is what I keep saying, is that the southern border is important, but this is an inflection point in the history of the world, right? And I'm sorry, it's, to me, as a human being of the globe, as a European and as a Brit and as a Westerner, that is more important than what goes on the southern border. That's not to say that what goes on at the southern border in the US is not important, of course, but it's walk and chew gum. Ukraine's geography demands especially skilled coordinators. So now we're going on to sort of the time deficit, what's going to go on going forward. The UK, it talks about the project Operation Interflex and training. People will now train 33,000 in the UK, but that's 5-week training, where in the Second World War is like 22-week minimum. Ukraine's geography demands especially skilled coordination because tree lines prevent units from being able to see one another. The threat of artillery further drives dispersion, so that companies are often spread over nearly 2 miles of front. The terrain in Zaporizhia particularly encourages commanders to fight with isolated companies. In this geographic context, a capacity to synchronize activity beyond each unit's line of sight is needed so units can support one another and exploit each other's gains. Collective training in the Ukrainian military has rarely taken place above the company level, however, and the need to staff new units has also left most short of experienced officers. Over the course of the war, the number of active Ukrainian troops has quintupled with no significant rise in the number of trained staff officers. Interesting. In the theatre that requires Ukrainian officers to synchronize widely dispersed maneuvers with artillery fire, drone orbits, and the effects of electronic warfare, a shortage of field-grade officers means an inability to stitch together large-scale operations. Interestingly, from a Russian point of view, so whenever we have criticisms like this, and I'm not trying to make everything look really positive for the Ukrainians, it's just that I have so much info in my head from intercepts and from stuff that we hear about the Russians particularly. The Russians definitely have this issue. There's Rick the Ukrainian did a translation the other day of a guy who was in charge of a company, was he? But basically, there's like, yeah, shouldn't that person be a sergeant? Yeah, it should be, but it's not, and blah, blah, blah. And he's talking about the fact that all these people in these kind of officer positions were not officers or were lower down than they should have been, and they are really suffering from that. As you would in any time of attrition, you're going to be suffering with that, as you're then bringing in fresh recruits who are just green around the gills, but they aren't going to be the officers, so you're replacing both officers and squaddies, if you like, with just squaddies, and so you will dilute the officer corps. Sorry, lack of terminologies going to British Armed Forces there. Anyway, during the 2023 offensive, Ukrainian operations were largely fought by pairs of companies under the close management of the understaffed brigade command post. The result was that while Ukrainian soldiers often succeeded in taking enemy positions, they were rarely able to exploit the breaches they made to quickly reinforce their gains. Instead, they had to stop and plan, giving Russian forces time to reset. If the Ukrainian military cannot expand the scale at which it operates, this experience risks being repeated. Delivering the proper training, however, will need time. In other words, this should be a time of proper training, not just quick 5-week Operation Interflex or whatever NATO's doing in Europe. This needs to be longer training. It also needs to be officer corps training as well. And then there's obviously the issue of Kyiv's need for materiel. So we're talking about a lot of ammunition rounds, a lot of artillery rounds. As we know, they were firing 7,000 rounds. They were above the Russians at that point in what they are firing as a fire rate. And now they've gone down to 2,000 rounds. The Russians have gone up to 10,000 rounds, having received a bunch of ammunition from North Korea. Indeed, without achieving such areas of localized artillery superiority, Ukraine will struggle to blunt Russian attacks. Russia currently fields about 340,000 troops in southern Ukraine. For much of the war, those troops' offensive potential was limited by logistic constraints, but Russia was also hobbled by the high level of casualties inflicted by Ukraine, up to 1,000 dead and wounded per day during the heaviest periods of fighting. Incurring so many casualties forced Russia to send undertrained personnel to the front line, exactly what I was just talking about. While that did not stop Moscow from attempting offensive maneuvers, it limited their effectiveness. The challenge for Ukraine is that even while it maintains its defensive posture, it must continue to mount localized offensives. And this is what I've said many times, and I said earlier, is that they can't just sit back and reconstitute, because doing that allows Russia to sit back and reconstitute, and Russia have a bigger army than the Ukrainians, so they need to somehow be able to reconstitute and rotate at the same time as inflicting high attrition rates on the Russians at certain points. And this is the beauty. I don't mean beauty because actually it's horrific and people are dying, but that's the beauty of Krinky from a zoomed out point of view. So Krinky is this place where 200 to 300 Ukrainian soldiers are effectively being used as bait to lure in the Russians, to fix them so that they are fixed there, and then they are attrited at massive levels. And that appears to be definitely happening, as according to virtually every single source, like Russian and Ukrainian sources alike. Now, these Ukrainians going back across the the Dnipro River, injured or exhausted, to then get interviewed by the New York Times will tell you, oh, it's a suicide mission. And in some respects, quite possibly, but it's a suicide mission that is for a greater good. I mean, you can talk about what happened in terms of Churchill and Dunkirk, right? And sacrificing certain units so that people could escape in Dunkirk and so on and so forth in, the darkest hour and so on and so forth. That was that kind of mentality of what we call moral consequentialism, where you will kind of have an evil or a bad for a greater good, right? And the greater good here would be fixing and attriting Russian forces at significant levels. But to do that, you have to sacrifice some of your own troops. And who wants to be those guys? And when those guys come back, of course, they're going to be pretty downbeat about their experiences. But that's one example of how the Ukrainians can attrit whilst being in a defensive posture. It could be that, oddly enough, it could be about inviting the Russians to attack. Because essentially what they're doing in Krinky is inviting the Russians to attack them and to beat them back from their bridgehead. So I no longer think this bridgehead is that, realistically, are the Ukrainians going to massively expand this bridgehead? Well, apparently they are expanding it a little bit right now, but first time for a long time. But essentially, I don't know that that's even one of their realistic intentions. It's about inviting the Russians onto your swords, right? Standing there, come and run at us. Okay, brilliant. Okay, and next one, come. Yep. Okay, next one, and you just invite the Russians to attack you, so that they, as I keep saying, commit some kind of maneuver harikiri. Well, that seems to be what's happening in Krinky, and it wasn't that the Ukrainians invited them to do so at Avdiivka or Novomyrkylivka, but it appears to be what the Russians are doing there, and they are attacking and attriting, or the Ukrainians are massively attriting the Russian personnel and equipment. So at this time of reconstitution, yes, the Ukrainians are going to have to keep reinforcing those particular areas, but if they can keep everywhere else vaguely quiet, so that they can rotate and reconstitute and regather and everything like that, while inflicting really significant losses in a number of places, and maybe switch those places up and say, right, okay, let's take the foot off the gas there and let's put the foot on the gas somewhere up here, and then cause the Russians to then be fixed in that place and attrit there, whilst not so much at the previous place, then I think Ukrainians might look to do that, or they have to look to do that, because they can't allow the Russians just completely regenerate, because the Russians have a greater potential for more armed forces than the Ukrainians in terms of boots on the ground, in terms of a larger population and a willingness to just be dictatorial and say, right, the forced mobilization, you're going to do it and it's going to be harsh, and we're going to round up immigrants, and we're going to go to Nepal and bribe people, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. The Russians are just going to be more able to generate those kind of troops. And what the Ukrainians want to do is make sure that those troops don't get any training and go straight to the front line, because it's so attritional at the front line that those Russian troops are getting sent in, whereas the Ukrainians aren't losing to the same degree. So if they're losing at, say, as was mentioned here, 1-7, I mean, I know that's your upper end of the ratio, but if they are losing at something like that in a given place, then that will allow the Ukrainians to reconstitute, but it won't allow the Russians to. And that's kind of what the Ukrainians need. Not kind of what they need, it is what they need. Okay, so the challenge for Ukraine is, indeed, as I said, is that even while it maintains a defensive posture, it must continue to mount localized offensives. If Russia sustains fewer losses, the capabilities of its forces in the field will improve. Diminishing pressure on the front lines would offer Russia other advantages too. Moscow would be able to divert experienced troops to train recruits, potentially allowing it to open new offensive axes in the second half of 2024. Russian forces could also concentrate on sectors where they can establish a more favorable battlefield geometry and inflict heavier losses on Ukraine. I mean, unfortunately, they just failed to do that. They've had ample opportunity to do that, but where they've tried to do that, like Novomyrkylivka, like Bakhmut, although slightly more success at the moment in Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Krinky, the Russians are just unable to convert that into a ratio that's advantageous for them. If Ukraine leaves large sections of the front quiet, Russian forces may also be able to significantly expand their fortifications. So this is what happened in the period where Ukraine were not attacking and waiting to start their counteroffensive. And as I said a number of times, the Ukrainians did not receive the materiel soon enough. They were waiting to get enough ammunition. They were waiting to get their troops trained back from Europe. But in waiting to become more prepared, it allowed the Russians to become more prepared defensively. And so you had both sides were unprepared and probably would have had parity, and then both sides got more prepared and you still got parity. So actually there was no advantage conveyed by waiting and getting the materiel. In one sense, you still, and this is why some people could advocate that the Ukrainians attacked much earlier, but of course they wouldn't have the material, they wouldn't have the trained troops, but they could take advantage of the lack of preparation by the Russians, so on and so forth. If Ukraine leaves large sections of the front quiet, the Russian forces may significantly expand their fortifications, making future Ukrainian offensive operations harder to carry out. Even while it holds a defensive posture, the Ukrainian military must seek to maximize Russia's rate of attrition. And Andrew Perpetua has long advocated for this defensive posture. He said that the Ukrainians, and I guess he could be correct here. He states that the Ukrainians should never attacked in 2023 at all, and just spent the whole year doing kind of what they're doing now, while also hitting them with distance munition, hitting the Russians with Storm Shadows and ATACMS and whatnot, and HIMARS. And then being properly prepared. But of course, then the Russians would have been really, really prepared. Ukraine will need about 2.4 million rounds of ammunition per year, but Ukraine's international partners, including the US, will struggle to provide half of that in 2024. Ukraine will need approximately 1,800 replacement artillery barrels per year. So it's not just ammunition, it's also these components of their weaponry. The handful of barrel machines in Europe cannot meet this demand. I mean, the advantage Russia has had is the thousands and thousands of artillery pieces left after Soviet era, left in these big yards and fields all right across Russia. Okay, we're losing 40 bits of artillery a day. It's all right. We're just going to replace them either wholly or we're going to cannibalize what we have. And the question is, how long have Russia been able to, or will Russia be able to do that? I think they've probably come to the end of that ability, and I think we're starting to see that in statistics concerning artillery losses. But Europe, I mean, it takes an awful long time to manufacture these barrels. These are heavy bits of metal, and the manufacturing process for them is not quick. It's not like making polystyrene cups on a conveyor belt. Like, these things take a lot of resources to make and a lot of time. The handful of barrel machines in Europe cannot meet this demand. The numerous fleets of vehicles gifted to Kyiv over the past 2 years also need a reliable supply of spare parts. Air defense interceptors will be persistent requirement too. Russia is now producing over 100 cruise and ballistic missiles and 300 attack drones per month. Those are the big drones, not like all drones. I claim it's 300,000. I think that's BS, but 100 cruise missiles. So, all the time those missiles are doing damage. At the moment, they are pretty much exclusively hitting the Ukrainian military industrial complex, their manufacturing capabilities, factories. That will hurt the Ukrainians in what they're trying to do to meet the demand for their material, in light of the fact that it's not as forthcoming from allies as they would like. Ukrainian President Zelensky, fearing that US support will end with the upcoming American presidential election, has declared that all Ukrainian territory occupied by Russia must be liberated by October 2024. So this is, I mean, it's highly unlikely, but this just goes to show. I know some of my American viewers are like not so bothered or are politically divided on this because they want to be really, really pro-Republican and pro-Republican politicians, because you are Republican, some of you. And so this issue with the border and funding leaves you divided, and there's what we call cognitive dissonance in your mind, where you've got evidence against a position of core belief. And so what many of you will do, rather than slag off the GOP or those politicians, is to get rid of that disharmony. Your core belief that the GOP is awesome is to then dismiss this as not being a problem, or to agree and say, actually, yes, the southern border is so much more important that actually Ukraine isn't important, and that evidence is therefore kind of harmonized with your core belief that the GOP is great because they're making the right decisions and going along with that. It's much more difficult to say, actually, I'm a really big Republican, I'm a really big fan of Republican politics, but they just got this one thing wrong. Because actually, that's quite difficult to deal with this one. We're kind of much better at being all in. I'm all in. Yeah, everything they do is great, and I've got to stand behind it. We're not very good at being nuanced. I say this about things like Elon Musk, right? Which is, people don't like to say he's amazing, but actually that element of what he does is sucks big time. I had someone arguing again with me about Elon Musk today. It's like, we need to be nuanced. It's that, yeah, he's amazing at doing that and that, but actually he really sucked on that thing. And it's the same with our political preferences as well. Well, like, the party I like is really good, and I love them. That's why I support them and vote for them. But actually, they sucked on that one thing, and I should be nuanced enough to be able to allow for that. This is not achievable, he says, i.e. taking their territory back, the Ukrainians taking their territory back to 1991 levels by October this year, given the material available in Ukraine all the time that its military needs to properly train its troops. But it's not reasonable for Kiev's Western allies to demand that Ukraine's generals create a detailed longer-term plan before they commit to offering new support. Without being sure of what equipment they can rely on receiving, Ukraine's military leaders cannot determine what kind of operations they can mount and when. In short, preparing for the next phase of the war has become a chicken and egg problem for Kiev and Washington. Okay, let's just to translate that into easy speak. Allies are saying, right, you need to come up with a plan. And once you come up with a decent plan, we'll then commit loads of equipment to you and loads of military assistance and aid and money. But we're not going to do that until you show us you've got a good plan. And the Ukrainians go, we're not going to make a good plan until we know we've got that stuff, because we can't make a plan if we don't know how much kit we have. I'm not going to sit and work out this very detailed offensive maneuver based on what we might have. We need to know what we do have. So you need to give us a kit and then we'll do the plan. No, that's not how. And so chicken the egg. Okay, Western leaders must emphasize, he continues, that longer-term investment in manufacturing capacity is both affordable and ultimately benefits Ukraine's allies. Goodness me, have I talked about this enough? The total defense budgets of the 54 countries supporting Ukraine well exceed $100 billion per month. That's just what we spend on defense. Together, collectively, as an allied force, is $100 billion per month. By contrast, current support for Ukraine costs those states less than $6 billion a month. So it's less than 6% of the defense budgets, not overall budgets, just defense budgets among the allies. The biggest barriers to ensuring that Ukraine does not lose the war are political. Funding Ukraine has often been framed as merely giving money to Kyiv. This is, however, deeply misleading. Goodness me, yeah, preaching to the choir here. Converted, singing to the choir, I don't know. Much of the aid that Ukraine will need constitutes an investment by its partners in their own domestic defense manufacturing and will be spent at home. A significant proportion of aid to Ukraine will eventually be recovered by the recipient in taxes, while boosting manufacturing jobs across NATO's member countries. At a time of economic strain, such investment should be widely welcomed by publics in countries supporting Kyiv. And of course, obviously, it upgrades your own armed forces as well. So, like I've said with the US Army many times, if they give their older equipment to Ukraine, that money isn't sent to Ukraine. That money is spent on getting new kit for the US Army and giving Ukraine the older kit, which is, you're basically expediting the upgrading of your own military power. That's what, and that money is being spent at home. So it also often been suggested that US support for Ukraine comes at the expense of the American military's readiness to deter China. But if China sees that the United States is unable to sustain a military effort, whether in Europe or Asia, deterrence is eroded. So expanding manufacturing to meet Ukraine's needs is vital. The US has a treaty obligation to come to the defense of European allies. Anyway, I'm going to join it a little bit later for the end of it. Some leaders in Western capitals now argue that it is time to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. This line of thinking, however, misses both the extent of Russia's goals and what the Kremlin would realistically offer. Moscow is not interested in simply seizing some Ukrainian territory. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated that he wants to change the logic of the international system. If the US asks its partners to make concessions to Russia to obtain a token ceasefire, two things will likely happen. First, Russia will persistently breach the ceasefire, as it did with all iterations of the 2015 Minsk agreements, while rebuilding its military to finish the task of occupying Kyiv. That is so true. Look at the form. Don't do a deal with Russia because they've broken every deal they've ever really done. They're just a terrible deal maker. Second, Russia will argue to its allies that the US can be beaten through perseverance. This will likely lead many US security partners to seek an insurance policy, reducing the United States' influence around the world. If the US kind of packs up its bags and leaves, that's all the Western allied forces going, we ain't doing jack for the US or with the US anymore. Now, I know it's the understanding that actually they do a lot for us, but there's still this, they do a lot for us. The US does a lot for us because it's in their best interest to do a lot for us. So it's a win-win. This is a positive sum game. This is how alliances work, right? And sometimes entities within an alliance will do much of the heavy lifting. But they'll only do that heavy lifting if it is still in their best interest to do so. So even though the US has been complaining that they've been paying more on their defense spending as per NATO criteria for the last however many years, it's still actually within their interest to do that, because actually their entire economic strategy is based on spending that, whereas the Europeans aren't. And if they were to pay the same level as the Europeans, then actually that would economically bugger the US. And so actually it is in their interest to do that, whilst also getting the benefits of the alliance. However, they would also like the Europeans to spend more. But as I said recently, if the Europeans were to spend more as they are now, and they're looking inwards to buy a lot of stuff from their own and to reinvigorate their own military industrial complex, then actually that makes the EU stronger and more independent of the US. And so the US loses some influence. So if the US is the bigger brother in the NATO, yes, it's going to moan that these guys aren't pulling their weight. But in the US pulling more weight, it actually has influence and power over those other smaller players. And if those smaller players get bigger because they are spending more and they are becoming more independent of the US, then the US will lose some kind of power and influence and possibly even economic income and whatever as a result. So I'm not necessarily saying that's the case, but these are interesting discussions. I had a video on that the other day. Okay. Anyway, it continues. The United States and its European allies face a choice. He finishes. They can either make an immediate plan to bolster the training they provide to the Ukrainian military, clarify to their publics and to Ukraine that the October 2024 deadline to liberate a territory must be extended, and underwrite Ukraine's material needs through 2025. That's a good option. Or they can continue to falsely believe that the war is a stalemate, dithering and ceding the advantage to Russia. This would be a terrible mistake. In addition to expanding its partnerships in Africa, Russia is strengthening its collaboration with China, Iran and North Korea, and you can add to that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc., and all the BRICS. And if a loss in Ukraine ends up demonstrating that the West cannot meet a single challenge to the world security architecture, its adversaries will hardly believe it can deal with multiple crises at once. Interesting. Hopefully you found that interesting, and I could help by providing some extra commentary to that too. Now, the only other thing I really wanted to talk about, because goodness me, that was a good gee whiz 30 minutes of conversation. Right, I'm not sure I really had the time to do this. So Radhika Pereira, whom I attacked this morning in one of my videos and said, look, this is really kind of trollish rhetoric that is very much pro-Kremlin. And as some people have said, I don't know whether you're so pro-Kremlin as much as being just anti-US. I think there's an element here, Radhika. But anyway, there is an interesting question in here, but it's one that I have dealt with a lot previously. In fact, I dealt with it at the beginning of the war. I mean, both things can be true. Russians are wrong for invading Ukraine, and the US is wrong for pushing Ukraine into NATO, being fully aware that it might prompt Russians to invade. The US is also wrong for using Ukraine to accomplish its geopolitical goals. Just like you said in the previous video, using Ukraine as a tool to achieve its own geopolitical ambitions. This is no way saying anything about Ukraine. So let's translate that. So what he's saying is that, because I talked about using people instrumentally as a means to an end, and he said, but are the US using Ukraine in a kind of proxy war way to degrade Russia so fundamentally they can't come back? And this is what Lloyd Austin said back in April last year. Now, the US, we've got to remember there's several things that's so bloody important to mention here, right? The US didn't go to war. The war was started by Russia invading Ukraine. So it's not like NATO and the US went, I know, we're going to start a war with Russia and we are going to use Ukraine to instrumentally degrade Russia to such an extent that they can't fight in a generation's time. That's not how these things causally went, how they worked. It was Russia invaded Ukraine, and then NATO came to help Ukraine, and the US and the UK and allied nations got together in the EU and said, right, we're going to help you for all of these reasons, all the reasons I've said from many a video. And wouldn't it be nice if we can degrade Russia? It's not like we're using Ukraine to do that from the outset. It's like, now we are supporting you in this war. Let's put an end to Russia once and for all. Now, this might also, so where this came from was the theory that the Americans are only drip feeding Ukraine so that they can effectively use Ukraine to fundamentally degrade Russia over a much longer period. And of course, his question there assumes that that is actually what the US are doing. And I don't think that's what they're doing. I think the reason why they've been drip feeding weaponry, although there is some evidence to support that theory, I think it's more likely that it's over fear of escalation, which never came to be. But people like Jake Sullivan and other people in the administration in the US and others around the world, like Olaf Scholz as well, and others previously have been very afraid of escalation, particularly nuclear escalation. So that was one of the reasons. And also fear of Russia breaking up is apparently a really big reason. And so they didn't want to completely destroy Russia for those reasons. And also, I think, largely to do with keeping strategic stocks back at home. So I think there's going to be elements of Taurus. The Germans don't have enough Taurus there, although you can argue why aren't they building them. You can argue about ATACMS, they're not wanting to give ATACMS until they've got the replacement, the PRISM replacement for them, and so on and so forth. So actually, I think those ideas are much more likelier explanations for why the US particularly has been drip feeding equipment to Ukraine. And I don't think it's using Ukraine to long-term attrit Russia. I think that's just how it's turned out, and therefore you can look back on that and post hoc rationalize that. You can rationalize that back after the fact and say that's what they did, they purposefully did that. No, I think that's incidentally what happens. But also there's this element here about, and he said it in a number of other comments, talking about NATO. Look, I'm not talking about some pinky promise made when USSR was collapsing. NATO did expand eastward and Russians did nothing, but expanding into Ukraine is totally another animal. Many experts did agree, including German president and French president, expanding NATO into Ukraine is a bad idea, blah, 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 blah. And this is idea, and many of the other comments as well, has been like, NATO is to blame for this war, right? And this really pees me off. I wrote an article back in March 2022, and it is the Russia-Ukraine conflict quite so clear-cut. So it had only been going a couple of weeks, and I looked at this, and there were a couple of articles that came out, and one was by a chap called someone Green, here it is on fair.org, Bryce Green, centre leftist, writing what you should really know about Ukraine. And he was presenting this case that basically it was NATO encroachments on Ukraine and on the borders of Russia, and therefore it's NATO's fault that the war started. And what really irritates me about these positions, and actually, I'm sorry, and therefore by extension, what Radhika's saying here, I mean, does irritate me, because I think it's completely one-tracked vision. Is saying, I'm only going to look at NATO and look at what NATO does, and I'm not going to understand that NATO acts in reaction to, or in concert with, or in relation to what the Soviet Union or what Russia is doing. And I'm only going to look at NATO, and therefore everything that happens as a result of these activities back in history are a result of NATO. And of course it's utterly ridiculous that's the case. It's like, imagine looking at a married couple, like, Peter and Harriet, right? And looking at what Harriet's done right throughout the relationship, all the way through, and with their child, and they both brought up this child, and the child ends up being like a horrible human, and actually is what they've both done together, and their parenting styles and all this kind of stuff, and then the child becomes a murderer, and then looking only at Harriet and saying, I can't believe Harriet made that child, and oh my God, and those, the genetics of that child and the parenting of that child. Hang on, he's been involved in that parenting and genetics as well, and he was like 50-50 involved in the parenting, blah, blah, blah. But just by looking at Harriet, it means I want to blame Harriet. I'm out to blame Harriet, and I don't want to blame her husband at all. So by looking at NATO and saying NATO is to blame, is to be single-mindedly hell-bent on blaming the West and exonerating USSR and then the Russian Federation. And it's an absolutely false move. But it's also not to say that it's 50-50 either. So and this is where it gets really difficult. So causality in philosophy is very difficult to untangle, and even what causality is, people are, it's not a done deal, right? But I won't go into the abstract abstract entanglement of causality. But I am going to just go back to this article here. So the article basically was all about blaming NATO for everything, and Euromaidan and Crimea and everything, and at the expense of two things. At the expense of the self-determination of Ukraine. And that's the main thing to remember here. Stop seeing Ukraine as a political football between NATO and Russia, and ask what Ukraine wants. And ask, now over 80% are in a favour of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, I know that wasn't always the case. But why wasn't it always the case? What was happening back in the early 2000s and after the 1990s? Well, Russia were massively meddling in Ukraine. They've always meddled in Ukraine. It was part of the Soviet Union. So, of course, there are huge influences from Russia. But if you only look at Ukraine, you are not understanding how much Russia has been involved. So when you're looking at Euromaidan and saying, NATO on the sidelines, or the IMF, or John McCain, or Victoria Nuland, or whoever, all these people, and you're only looking at them, and you're not understanding all the pro-Russian influence and all the pro-Russian politicians that are being paid by the Kremlin in Ukraine to do that, and the Russian politicians in Russia doing exactly that, but you're just not looking at them because, hey, it's always the US's fault, or it's always NATO's fault, it's always the West's fault. And so you are giving a free pass for Russia to do what they like. And then, when the 2014 conflict starts, you're not looking at little green men going into Russia. You're not into Ukraine. You're not blaming the Russians at all, because it's always these guys' faults. But it's to understand that why were NATO hanging around here? Why was John McCain hanging around here? Why was Victoria Nuland hanging around here? And it's understanding that there are these reactions, and it takes two to tango. So again, it goes back to, how about Russia were encroaching? So it's the idea that NATO encroached is itself a really big problem. because it completely ignores the whole concept of this is Russia encroaching that prompted NATO to go, oh, we might need to play our pawn in this area. It's this geopolitical chess game that's been going on between, from the Cold War and onwards, so that NATO is reacting to a Russian move, or Russia's reacting to a NATO move, and so on and so forth. And it's this causal interaction that turns into a matrix that, when you then point and look at NATO and say they are solely responsible for this in their encroaching, is just insanely naive. But it gets way more problematic when one side openly invades the country in question. NATO didn't invade. Russia did, and that's kind of all you need to know. So although there's this causality that's going on where it takes two to tango, it's only Russia who invaded. It's only Russia who sent men to kill other men and to kill civilians and to commit 160,000 registered war crimes. That's only Russia that did that. So don't give me the, NATO expansionism, NATO imperialism, US imperialism. Yeah, you can argue there's elements of that in the world. Of course there is. But that is insanely myopic and insanely one-tracked. And it therefore bastardizes exactly what actually happens. And here's my conclusion. I'll leave you with my conclusion here. I could bang on for another 2 hours about this. I'll just leave you with my conclusion. Bear in mind, you might not get some of the references to what I'm saying here because you've got to read the whole article. Go and read it. I'll link it below. I think it's a pretty good article. I'd probably change a few things now that it's 2 years on, and now I know a lot more about this whole conflict. Where do we go from here? What I take from Green's analysis, so this kind of blaming NATO, is that, yes, there are always two sides to a coin. Yet you can be rational in saying that one side is still wholly preferable to the other. That said, we all profit from good and accurate reporting of current events. Such media coverage at times of war is often partisan, drumming up support for one side or the other to rally round a flag. Media entities, both internationally and unwittingly, both intentionally and unwittingly, play their part in the propaganda machines, perpetuating simplistic us and them attitudes. Nuance doesn't lend itself to decisive action, and wartime scenarios demand quick and decisive action. Confusing and complex narratives, even if they are far more accurate, can sometimes blur and cause hesitation as playmakers and the public spend time quarrying for truth. Perhaps this can be dangerous and distracting. Then again, perhaps it could save lives. What do we do with Green's criticisms? We must recognise that when nations, organisations or individuals act on the political stage, they have reasons. The reasons, sadly, are hardly ever for the good of the world, unless that good of the world is well disguised and under a costume of free market ideology or some other political or economic worldview. The question should always be whether, concerning the actions of such players or the financial subsidisation by such players, what do they seek to gain? So when the US is supporting Ukraine and giving it a suitcase full of cash, or when the EU is making this or that play, and equally when Putin is injecting money and influence into Crimea and eastern Ukraine, what are they seeking to gain? And what is the opportunity cost of not gaining that goal? The problem is that meddling is often reactive. We meddle as some counterbalance because they seem to have meddled, which is also what they say. It's rather like nuclear disarmament. The issue with this is when one side chooses or continues to meddle, does the other side just sit by and let it happen? As the main players in the board game of global dominance move their major pieces and spend their money by the million and billion, the expendable pawns end up paying the price. How do we play going forward? What do we learn from our previous games? And if the other main player doesn't change their tactics, should we change ours? The war games continue, watched by millions. But soldiers die in the thousands, and refugees increase by the hundreds of thousands. The sadness is immeasurable. The desperation unbounded by borders. This is a geopolitical game of chess. But as I talk about a lot in that article, we shouldn't forget that this is not just a match between NATO and the West and Russia. There is a third player, the most important player here, and that is Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Let's just ask them what they want. And that should give us pause to think that, hey, NATO is this big encroaching bully. And maybe realise that Russia itself is one of the biggest encroachers in that region. Think about Eurasia, think about the Caucasus, think about Eastern Europe. Think about what's happening in Serbia, Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia. I don't see Radika whinging about Russian imperialism there. I don't see any understanding that Russia at the moment has far more imperialistic intentions than NATO ever has. To me, Putin, and you can tell that by his Peter the Great obsessions and so on and so forth, is just a good old-fashioned emperor wanting more and more for his own personal gain. Right, I'm going to leave you with a bit of humour. You may have seen these Bentley adverts that the Ukrainians have been kind of taking a mickey out of.
Better. Better.
Brilliant.
Better.
Okay, and so that's that one. There's also a helicopter one, which is, fantastic as well. I'll just play you the opening part of that. So on. So on and so forth. Anyway, there's just another one of these Mickey taking sort of meme videos that I think is fabulous. So here's another one. You're thinking at the beginning, oh, what's going on here? But, good bit of Ukrainian humour. I just love it. Brilliant. Anyway, thanks guys. Take care. I really appreciate all your support. Thanks to all those who have supported me on all the platforms that you have done, by here and PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee and all that. I really appreciate it. Sorry this was a massively long one. I'll try and do a really short one tomorrow. Take care. Toodle pips.